Beneath the House of Lords lay 36 barrels of gunpowder, packed tightly enough to kill a king, his heir, and nearly every member of Parliament in a single explosion. It would have been the single most devastating act of political violence in English history. This is the story of the men willing to carry it out, and a question that still divides historians 4 centuries later. Were they men driven to violence by years of suffering, or men who chose atrocity when other paths remained open to them? If you appreciate this type of content, gently tap that like button and subscribe for more stories like this. Let's dive in. To understand how matters reached that cellar, the story must begin decades earlier. Under Elizabeth I, English Catholics who refused to attend Church of England services were branded recusants and fined £20 a month, simply for practicing their faith in the way they knew. A penalty severe enough to strip families of their land and livelihood. Priests were hunted, executed, or forced into hiding. When James I inherited the throne in 1603, many English Catholics allowed themselves to hope, quietly, that the persecution might finally ease. His own mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been a Catholic put to death by the Crown. That hope did not survive contact with reality. James left the fines in place, and in the years following 1605, Parliament tightened the penalties further still. For a generation of English Catholics, this was not a single injury. It was the latest in an unbroken line of promises made and promises broken. It was out of this exhaustion that Robert Catesby emerged. A Warwickshire gentleman from an old Catholic family, Catesby had watched peaceful petitions accomplish nothing and had concluded by 1604 that no lawful avenue remained. He began recruiting men he trusted completely, men who shared both his faith and his desperation, with a plan to kill the king and much of the government in one blow and ignite a Catholic uprising in the ruins. The historian Antonia Fraser has argued that Catesby had genuinely come to see this as the only door still open to him. Other scholars are less generous, noting that beyond the explosion itself, there was almost no organized plan to seize power in its aftermath. A gamble built more on grievance than on strategy. Catesby's circle eventually grew to 13 men. Among them were the brothers Christopher and John Wright, old friends of Catesby's from his youth and experienced fighters in their own right. Thomas Wintour, who had travelled to Spain seeking foreign support for English Catholics before the plot took its final shape, and Francis Tresham, a wealthy but erratic cousin brought in late, largely for his money. Tresham's inclusion matters for reasons that stretch beyond the plot itself. He was related by marriage to Lord Monteagle, and in the years since, some historians have wondered whether he, rather than some more distant well-wisher, was the one who quietly warned his brother-in-law to stay home. Among those Catesby recruited was Guy Fawkes, a soldier from York who had spent years fighting for Catholic Spain in the Netherlands. He was chosen for one reason. He understood gunpowder better than any man available to the conspiracy. Working through the conspirator Thomas Percy, who secured a position granting access to the buildings adjoining Parliament, the group leased a cellar directly beneath the House of Lords. Over the months that followed, they smuggled in 36 barrels of gunpowder in small, deliberate loads to avoid drawing suspicion, and buried the barrels beneath piles of firewood and coal to disguise what the cellar truly held. The plot was undone, in the end, by a single letter. On October 26, 1605, an anonymous warning reached Lord Monteagle, urging him to stay away from the opening of Parliament and stating plainly that they shall receive a terrible blow, this Parliament. Monteagle carried it directly to Robert Cecil, the King's chief minister, more than a week before the planned attack. In the early hours of November 5th, 1605, a search party, led by Sir Thomas Knivett, moved through the undercroft beneath Parliament and found a man standing guard over the barrels, dressed for travel, a lantern and slow matches in hand. He gave his name as John Johnson. It was Guy Fawkes, moments from being dragged into the centre of a story that would outlive him by 400 years. When the plotters were finally cornered and Fawkes was brought before the King's Privy Council, he showed no fear. Asked what he had intended to do with so much gunpowder, he answered that his purpose was to blow you Scotch beggars back to your native mountains. Even King James, who had every reason to despise him, was struck by his composure, later describing Fawkes as possessing a Roman resolution. That resolution broke in the Tower of London, where days of torture eventually forced him to name every man who had stood beside him. The rest of the conspiracy did not survive much longer than Fawkes's composure had. Catesby and several others fled London and made their stand at Holbeche House in Staffordshire, where, on November 8th, 1605, a siege by the Sheriff of Worcestershire's men left Catesby and 2 others dead. The remaining plotters were captured, tried alongside Fawkes, and in late January 1606 executed by hanging, drawing and quartering, a public death designed as much to deter future conspiracies as to punish this one. The plot's failure was folded into law almost immediately. Parliament passed the observance of 5th November Act in 1606, mandating an annual day of thanksgiving for the King's survival, and Londoners marked the occasion that same year, with bonfires and bell ringing across the city. What began as a government-mandated commemoration gradually took on a life of its own over the following centuries, evolving into the bonfire and fireworks traditions still practiced across Britain every November 5th, a piece of national memory that has outlasted nearly everything else about the plot. Cecil, in fact, had held that warning for more than a week before ordering any search of the cellars, time enough to act immediately, and yet the cellars were not searched until the night before Parliament opened. Some historians have suggested Cecil already knew of the conspiracy and allowed it to ripen, the better to justify a harsher crackdown on Catholics once it was exposed. The historian Mark Nichols has examined this theory closely and concluded that while suggestive, the evidence for deliberate entrapment remains inconclusive. To this day, no one has ever proven who wrote the letter. So, which is the truer account of the men behind the Gunpowder Plot? Englishmen who had endured decades of fines, exile, and execution for their faith, and who came to believe that no peaceful path remained, or men who, however real their grievances, chose the deliberate killing of a king and his parliament, rather than continue enduring what generations before them had endured without resorting to violence. The historical record supports both readings, and neither one erases the other. Somewhere in that cellar stood men who had watched their families fined into poverty, their priests hunted down, their faith treated as a crime for as long as they could remember. And somewhere in that same cellar stood men prepared to kill a king, his children, and hundreds of others who had no say in any of it. Both of those truths sat side by side in the dark on the same 36 barrels. This has been a production of History Recast. If you enjoyed this video, please click the link and check out one of our other stories.